So hello and a very warm welcome to this UCL Chemistry Careers podcast on Should I Do a PhD? I'm Raj Sidhu, your host and Chemistry Careers consultant. By the end of this session, I'm confident you'll have a clearer idea as to the process, the pitfalls, the advantages and disadvantages of doing a PhD. To that end, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Anna Roffey.
Hello.
And Dr. Stephen Potts.
Hello.
Of UCL's Department of Chemistry. Why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about yourselves with the audience? Anna first.
Hi. So I did my PhD at UCL. I actually did my undergraduate at Bristol University, and I worked at the RSC in between, but I really wanted to get back into the lab, which is why I went and did the PhD. And now I'm back at UCL as a teaching fellow in the chemistry department.
Okay, Stephen.
I'm also a teaching fellow in the chemistry department, and I also did my PhD at UCL, but I also did my undergraduate at UCL. But I made sure I took a break, and I did a 5-year postdoc in the Netherlands, and then went on to a more teaching-focused role at Queen Mary for 3 years before returning to UCL at my current position.
Okay, so we're going to launch into the first question now, which is defining what a PhD is. What are your thoughts?
Well, I looked it up on Google, because as any good researcher would, and it stands for a Doctor of Philosophy. But basically, it's the highest level of degree that you can do. You do it after you have some form of undergraduate master's or bachelor's degree. And it's a 3 or 4 or possibly more year project where you do research and hopefully gain insight and push the boundaries of research, learn something new about an area.
So something novel, something quite unique about
Yes.
the research that's done as part of a PhD.
Yes.
Anything to add to that, Stephen?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. But one thing I would say is that more often than not, you generally have to have a master's level degree to start it. There are a few exceptional cases where people only have a bachelor's, but they really are exceptional. So if you're thinking of doing a PhD and you're in the earlier stages of your undergraduate degree, you probably want to do a master's, either a combined or separate one first.
Okay. And you mentioned PhDs can be 3 or 4 years or sometimes longer. Mm-hmm. What contingent factors might contribute to the differing timeframes?
So that probably depends on the funding that you have and the country in which you do the PhD. So here in the UK, a basic normal PhD will be 3 years, but sometimes you'll have funding for 4 years, and the first year will be more foundational and may include a separate master's of research in that first year.
Okay. Can you give me an example of 1 or 2 current PhD projects you may be aware of in the Department of Chemistry?
So to give examples of the typical types of PhD research we're doing in the Department of Chemistry at the moment, you've got organic synthesis PhDs where you're looking at making better routes to drug synthesis, or maybe the more inorganic ones where you're trying to make materials to improve either electronics or solar cells. And the more physical ones where we're analysing the components of the air or gases, or even down to the way molecules behave using lasers. And if you're not such a fan of the lab, there are also computational projects as well, so simulations of chemical processes that people look into. There's a wide range of topics.
Okay, what would you say typically takes place in years 1, 2 and 3 of a 3-year PhD?
Well, the first year you're typically getting to grips with the topic if you haven't been doing that in your master's, so it's not uncommon to go down a slightly different route to your master's. And by the end of it, you'll have got to know your group a little bit better, you'll be helping each other out and starting maybe to see some results. But you won't necessarily get results early on, that depends entirely on the topic you're looking at. Year 2, you should be a bit more advanced, you might be on the verge of writing your first paper, but caveat emptor, there is this thing called the second year blues where you're feeling depressed that you're not getting results you're expecting, but this is entirely normal. Lots of people get it, and it's always better afterwards. And then ideally in the third year, you've taken more control of the direction, maybe away from your supervisor, so you should have a better idea. You'll be getting lots of last experiments done, and you'll prepare for the write-up. Typically, you'll have at UCL certainly a first year Viva just to make sure that you're on the right track. And then you'll have a second year upgrade Viva to make sure that you're suitable to continue to do the full PhD. And in the very unlikely event that you're not, you might be suggested that you finish with an MPhil, so a Master's of Philosophy instead.
I'd heard about the final Viva. The years 1 and 2 are completely new to me. What do those look like?
Well, the year 1 Viva will typically be a one-on-one chat with an internal member of staff, and they just want to talk to you and see what your understanding is. They're not there to examine you or make you feel rubbish. The second year one is a bit more formal. I think we have 1 or 2 members of staff, but again, internal, so you'll know them. And they're just there to make sure that you will be ready in a year's time to actually defend your PhD. If it's looking like you're not, and again, this is incredibly rare, you'll probably just be offered the MPhil instead and get out a year early.
Okay. Stephen, you mentioned one thing in there a little bit earlier around getting used to the group. What does that mean?
Well, inevitably, you're not the only one working for your supervisor. They have lots of other group members as well. Sometimes we refer to it as the academic family, so you have your academic brothers and sisters. You'll be working alongside other PhD students, other master's students and postdoctoral students as well. So they're not students, they are postdocs who have completed their PhD and are taking a more leading role in research under the supervisor's umbrella. So you'll need to get on with all these people and help run the lab as well. So certainly for the wet chemical topics, it can be things like going to get the solvents together, making sure the lab's tidy and working together like that. But you can also help each other out by, can you do this NMR measurement for me? Could you fill this up for me? Could you just keep an eye on my reaction while I pop to my meeting? Or something like that. So it's a communal thing actually as well.
Great. Anna, how closely would you say your own experience in your PhD resembled that 3-year process?
Quite closely, although I have to say I didn't have a very big group. So although I had 2 other members of my group, I had like a much wider community of other groups that we all shared the lab. So actually I did have a very similar experience with my brothers and sisters in chemistry, but it wasn't actually inside my group. So there's loads of support out there. I don't remember doing a Viva in my first year. I probably did, but I don't remember. Some years ago.
It might be because it was a different institution. So what I've said was very much the UCL experience.
Yeah. Well, I did my PhD at
you did?
UCL, yeah. I remember doing a report in the first year, and I definitely remember doing an upgrade Viva in the second year, which I was very afraid of, but was absolutely fine. Everyone was the same amount afraid, and everyone did exactly the same. They did fine. And there were various other things, like doing posters. There were, so various sort of like touchstone assessment pieces along the way to kind of help you become a fully fledged researcher.
Brilliant. And for my own curiosity, you talk about your PhD families, your brothers and sisters. Are you both still in touch with those?
Very much so, yes. I see them regularly, and I actually draw on quite a few of them professionally as well. They've all gone into different careers, and yes, I find that really useful to have that network.
Oh yeah, just one other thing. It's not just about doing the research and then writing your thesis. It's about communicating the research you're doing. So often you'll be encouraged to go to conferences and ideally present something. You're not often allowed to go to a conference if you're not presenting. And that can be a poster, or if you're feeling brave, a talk. And I would remind you that at UCL Chemistry, we do ask all the third year PhD students to present their research in the PhD seminars in the third year, which is, as Anna said earlier, scary yet rewarding, and you feel great afterwards. I'd also like to add that people worry about the Vivas at the end of their PhD, but you will not be put in for your Viva until you are ready to take it. So please don't worry too much about failing it. That's an extremely rare circumstance.
Extremely rare.
Stephen, can you remember the first talk you gave at a conference?
Yes, but that was actually after my PhD. I remember the first poster. It was at the ACS, American Chemical Society conference in Boston. It was a massive room, loads of people, and I was standing there in my little shirt and tie nervously by my poster, and then my PhD supervisor coming along and saying, "Hey, here's my student, why don't you talk to him?" etc., etc. So it gets easier the more you do it. It's one of those things that the nerves will go and you get into it.
And I'm also sensing from that an international aspect. You mentioned Boston. Is that something a typical PhD might experience?
Absolutely. This is cutting edge research you're doing. So it's not just important in the UK, it's important internationally. And a lot of the big conferences are hosted internationally. And that's where you've got to go. And it's also great to meet people. Networking is important. So if you fancy doing, say, a postdoc in another country after your PhD, that's a great way to meet other people. And if they have you in the back of their mind, it can help a little bit.
That's
Brilliant.
how I got my postdoc.
Oh yeah, tell me more about that.
So I went to a conference in my final year of my PhD, and I didn't actually have a talk, I just had a poster, but I was quite diligent, and I stood by my poster and I made sure that I met lots of people, and I wasn't really sure about what I wanted to do after the PhD. A professor from a university in Sweden came and spoke to me, and he was really interested in my skill set because he could see from the research I'd done that I was able to do lots of different things, and he wanted those skills for his research group. And he offered me a postdoc in his group in Sweden, and I took it, and it was really fun for 2 years.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to good reasons for doing a PhD. I'd like to volunteer the first one.
Well, if you want to take a career in academia, you've got to have a PhD. So the first thing to do is, what do I want to do with my degree? And if it involves an academic career, you'll have to do a PhD. Indeed, maybe some industrial careers would expect you to have that level of qualification as well, because it shows that you have research skills. Maybe even certain teaching career paths as well. So make sure, if it's relevant to your career, that's a good reason to do a PhD. So just check first.
You mentioned an industrial link there, Stephen. Can you tell me more about that, please?
So in industry, a lot of it is research-based. You need to show that you're a competent researcher, and often, if you have a PhD, that won't hold you back. That will show that you can do research, and research to a good level, and that you can do it independently.
Yeah, actually, if I can jump in, I have friends who've worked in industry, especially organic, synthetic. I think the big companies, the big pharma companies, if you want to progress in that company, you can get a job with a lower level of qualification. But if you have a PhD, you show that you can do project management, which is a really, really vital skill to move up in a company like that. And so those research skills and those project management skills that you get from your PhD help a lot in industry, I think.
Can you tell me more about that project management side of it?
Yeah, it's something that you develop kind of organically, although you can do training during your PhD. And it's to do with being able to plan a project and organise your time effectively, but also organise your interactions with other people, because naturally you won't do things completely alone. You'll need things from other people, compounds, instruments, being able to have a sort of overview of your work, but at the same time be in your work enough to know what the next steps are.
What might you say to a master's student who is feeling like their project management skills might not quite be up to scratch to start a PhD?
That's okay. At the beginning of your PhD, you are not expected to have these skills. These are definitely things that you develop as you go through the 3 or 4 or however many years you have for your PhD. And you can do training, and that's really recommended.
Terrific. Okay, who'd like to volunteer a second good reason for doing a PhD?
So I think if you're interested in research, I think that is one of the best reasons to do. And that touches on what you said before, but I think you can really, if you enjoy your research project in your final year of your undergraduate, or if you do a taught masters, postgraduate taught masters research project, if you enjoy that research, even if the area isn't the area you want to stay in, if you enjoy doing that day to day, that's what you'll be doing day to day in your PhD. So that's a really good reason to want to do a PhD.
A love of research.
Yes.
Okay, so who'd like to volunteer a third good reason for doing a PhD?
I can tell you why I did a PhD.
Yeah.
I was working at the RSC, which is not lab-based. I was working in the publishing arm of the Royal Society of Chemistry. So on scientific journals and editing, and I was very into science because I was surrounded by it all the time, but I really missed being in the lab. So I knew that if I wanted to get a job in chemistry, because I'd been out of the lab for a few years, I needed to hone my skills, and so either a taught master's or a PhD was probably the way to go for me. So that's what I did.
How did you find that transition going back into the lab after a few years out?
It was challenging. I think it's challenging for anyone anyway, the transition from going from master's or whatever to a PhD. But for me, it was slightly harder because I had to remember a lot of things that I'd forgotten. But it was all in there somewhere. So after a few months, I was sort of back to the same level as everyone else.
Okay. Stephen, why did you do a PhD?
Well, actually, I'd signed up to an MSci in chemistry because I wanted to do the 4-year course and I wanted to be a chemist. I wasn't thinking too much about it early on, if I'm brutally honest, but I just liked chemistry. And during my master's, I realised that I really enjoyed the research involved and thought, actually, I can do this a bit more. I think deep down I wanted to go into some sort of teaching-based role, but I realised, as Anna said with industry, that if you want the more senior roles, it's a really good idea to have a PhD. So it was a combination really of tactical thinking of my career and enjoying the research as well. And it was really good. It's one of the best things I ever did, actually.
Wow, that sounds terrific. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about good reasons for doing a PhD, as well as your own respective motivations. What are bad reasons for doing a PhD?
I think the worst possible reason for doing a PhD is just that you haven't got anything to do and you're using it to fill the time between finishing your degree and getting a job. The reason it's a really bad decision is that you're not motivated. You need to be motivated to do a PhD. And as I mentioned earlier, there's that concept of the second year blues. And if that kicks in, you won't know what to do. From personal experience, I've known people drop out of doing a PhD because they were doing it just to fill in the gap. It seemed like easy money. You get a certain amount of money for doing it. And then their heart wasn't in it. So they dropped out.
So I'm getting a sense that motivation is a really key part of needing to do a PhD well. Why is it such an important thing?
Because it's a long, old slog to get your PhD. And one of the things they kind of tell you as you're doing it is if you can stay till the end, if you keep working and you keep going and you stay to the end, you'll get your PhD. And a lot of people think, oh, I'm not clever enough, or oh, I don't have the talent. But it's not really about that, because you develop all of the skills that you need by just doing it every day and staying in it. So it can be very difficult to motivate yourself for 3 years in a row to do essentially the same project. It may move around a bit, but you have to, it is your PhD, and at the end, you're the only person who can make it happen, and you have to produce the results. So the onus is very much on you. There's support around you, but it's your project, and you have to have the motivation to continue with it.
So am I potentially right in interpreting that as maybe the most successful PhDs are those who commit to the process of research?
Yeah, I think probably the most successful PhDs that I know are people who are really passionate about what they're doing. So for them, it's not really hard work to stay in it because they're loving what they do every day. And my own experience was that sometimes I loved it and sometimes I found it really, really challenging. And I had to have self-motivation to keep going through those periods where I wasn't sure if it was right for me or if I had it in me to continue. So I think if you love what you're doing, it's very easy. Yeah.
Okay, so love and passion are two words that I find really, really interesting in what you just said. I guess there's going to be a part of this PhD student population who will come in with a sense of passion for a particular research area. There are going to be some who don't. Is there scope within the PhD process to fall in love with a research area?
Oh, definitely. And I think we've all seen that. And I fell in love with my research area. I didn't know so much about it when I first started, and there were times when I didn't understand it or I didn't totally believe in it. But when you get a good result, after months and months of trying, you get that good result. It just feels amazing. There's nothing like it. You feel so achieved, and you're also doing something that no one's ever done before. It's really, really addictive in a way. And yes, it really drives your passion and your motivation, I'd say.
Anything to add to that, Stephen?
Well, just to say that when we talk about areas of research, it depends how big your umbrella is. So you can, just to build on what Anna said, you can fall in love with it during your PhD, because while it might be linked in some way to what you did in your master's, there's still quite a lot of difference. And my master's, my PhD and my postdoc were all loosely linked, but I would say different. And you just get infected with everyone else's enthusiasm as well, and especially if the group has a really good vibe as well, you kind of want to represent them well, and you make sure that everything you present is good and that you get good results.
Lovely. Okay, so what might the second bad reason for doing a PhD be?
I think probably a bad reason to start doing a PhD is to specifically become a professor. And the reason I say that is that academia isn't an enormous field to work in. It's quite big, but the number of PhD students, the ratio between PhD students and actual academics working in the field, that's pretty enormous. Not all PhD students will become professors, and it's really good to know that when you start. Having a PhD is a great stepping stone to other careers, but if you're very, very dedicated and there is a little bit of luck and you have a great support network and great mentors, you may become a professor, but it is not a guaranteed career. So I think that could be a bit of a difficult reason to do a PhD.
I think that's a really interesting point. In some research that I've been looking at, it's quoted as low as a 0.6% chance of converting a PhD into a professorial role. You mentioned the role of mentors there, Anna. Could you elaborate for me, please?
Sure. So during your PhD, you will have, or if you study at UCL in the chemistry department, you will have a mentor who will be another PhD student who is 1 or 2 years ahead of you in their research. But you'll also have informal mentors all around you. So other PhD students, other postdocs, people in the department that you know, your supervisor in some ways. You have a second supervisor who you may find mentoring you, people who give you support, basically.
Okay, so do we have a third bad reason for doing a PhD?
I suppose it's kind of linked to what I said about just filling in a gap and not doing a job. But the other thing you might think is, it's easy money. What you get in the UK is a stipend, which is a tax-free set amount of money, which is paid quarterly at the moment. And that's going to be around £15,000. But if you're just in it for just the money, I would say that the passion isn't there, and therefore you might again struggle to succeed in doing a PhD.
Yes, I would agree with that. I have to say that when it was some years ago, but when I started my PhD, I had come from full-time employment in a graduate role, and I only took maybe about £150, £200 a month pay cut, because you're not taxed on your stipend. So if you work it out monthly, it wasn't a massive pay cut, and I was able to get a student discount, which helped me a bit. But it's not a lot to earn for 3 or 4 years, so it's not a way to get money. It's definitely something you should do for the right motivation.
Okay, so you're still going to be living a student or a studenty type lifestyle on that budget?
Definitely.
I think it's worth pointing out, actually, that in the UK, PhD students are just that. They're students and they're still classed as such. So you can get all of the student benefits. If you go abroad, however, you're treated more as a worker, so you'll pay tax. Maybe you feel differently about that, but you certainly won't get the student discounts. So it's like a proper, in inverted commas, job abroad.
Okay, and what would you say to a candidate who wants to do a PhD so that they can have the words doctor in front of their name?
It's a very long time to get your PhD. It's a lot of time and effort to put in to just get 2 letters in front of your name and 3 letters after your name. I would say that you may live to regret that decision during the period of your PhD, unless you learn to love it. That's a different thing.
I think if you were to put that in a nutshell, it would be you earn your title.
What does that mean?
That means you put the work in and you'll earn it. It's not something you can just coast on. And I'm sure we've made that apparent, certainly from what Anna's just said. So you really do earn that title.
Okay, so we're going to talk now about emotional well-being during a PhD, a more personal side of doing a PhD. So completing a PhD is no doubt a task of attrition, focus, and at times one of relative isolation, doubt, and pressure, which can definitely affect mental health. How would you describe the pressures of doing a PhD, and to what extent can a PhD student mitigate those pressures?
It was certainly very challenging trying to keep on top of a lot of the deadlines. For example, you'll probably have a weekly meeting with your supervisor at which you're expected to show what you've done during that week and any results you've got. And sometimes, not necessarily through a fault of my own, or whether it was a fault of my own, it sometimes was, I didn't have anything concrete to show my supervisor. And that stressed me out, made me feel quite anxious. And well, to mitigate that, I either made sure if it was just going to be a 5-minute NMR to measure or something, I just made sure I would do it. I didn't at first, but that's something I grew into to make sure that I was more efficient. And if I genuinely didn't have anything, I made sure I had a good reason why not. In my case personally, I also had the additional pressure of being sponsored by an industrial company. So I had a case award, which meant I got a little bit of extra money on my stipend, but that meant having regular meetings with them and explaining what had happened. And as they're industrial rather than research, they sometimes wanted results now, which isn't always possible in research. But I just worked with my supervisor to see how we could best put it to them. And I often remember them saying that they were coming down on the train saying, oh, well, we're going to have words with them. And then they were always leaving saying, oh, that's really good, actually. So we worked together to make sure that we could satisfy them as well. And that helps a little bit.
Would you say the main relationship in a PhD is with the supervisor?
Depends on main. I would say, yes, okay, it's probably the main in the sense that you see them most frequently and they are your boss, if you want to use that term, but the postdocs in the group will inevitably be a very important relationship that will help you with things. As we've said, your academic family, other PhD students and master's students even will also be there. You form a little community usually. And that helps a lot mitigate any problems you have. Like if you're stressed out about something, you might go to your academic brother and say, have a whinge. And that sometimes just doing that can help ease things a bit. I certainly found that.
I definitely agree with that. I think a lot of the time when you're doing a PhD, you do feel a bit alone because, like I said before, your project is your own. And sometimes you have a large group, sometimes you don't. And you can feel a little isolated. But as soon as you speak to any other PhD students or even postdocs who were recent PhD students, you'll realise that everybody feels the same anxieties and the same pressures, and you're not alone, and that everything will be fine, everything will be okay. Eventually, you will just overcome whatever strife you're struggling with, and you will just get to the end of the PhD. Also, I would say, add to your point about supervisors, definitely for me, and I think for a lot of my cohort, it might not necessarily be such a close contact.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't actually have weekly meetings with mine, but it was definitely the most significant relationship that I had during my PhD, and something that can be sometimes difficult to manage depending on, because it's all personalities, so just depends. Sometimes your supervisor can be a little bit difficult to work with. It depends on who they are, but you can actually get support with that. So UCL runs specific training on how to manage your relationship with your supervisor. So if you have any difficulties or you're just trying to improve your general skill set, then that's something that you can do.
How malleable is that relationship? So for example, Stephen, you mentioned meeting with your supervisor once weekly. Anna, you mentioned it was potentially less frequently. Who decides that process?
The supervisor, I would say. It depends on them, depends on what their personality is a little bit. So if they're a bit more open, maybe you'll decide together. But a lot of supervisors will have had many PhD students, and they'll have their own way of working that they find most efficient or works with their timetable the best. So you tend to fit in around what works for them, and kind of you're training from them, you're learning from them. So if it works for them, probably it will work for you if you just go along with it.
I get that deadlines are potentially another source of anxiety, and that's something you referenced earlier, Stephen. How do deadlines work within a PhD structure?
The deadlines you might have, if you have a meeting with your supervisor, that is a deadline in effect that you might set yourself, even that I must have this to show them and this to show them, etc. At UCL, certainly the deadlines are your first year report, which goes with your first year viva, which I'm almost tempted to call a chat, because that's probably more like what it is. You'll also have a report that goes along with your upgrade viva in year 2, so that will be a certain deadline. Other deadlines might include getting your external examiner nominated even, and just declaring when you're going to submit your thesis. And the thesis is a deadline, I suppose, but experience tells me that's quite flexible, but it also depends on the funding. If you don't want to be writing your thesis while you're not funded, you'll probably want to be finished by the end of your funding period as well.
Okay, so I'm tempted to ask a somewhat controversial question because I feel our listenership may benefit from that. What would you say to those people who think that negative impacts on mental health are an inevitable part of a PhD?
I would say that it's person dependent and project dependent. Certainly, I have seen many of my fellow PhD students have moments and periods of time where they had struggled with mental health, maybe depression or anxiety, and so myself as well included. But I have also had students who have had very little by way of anxiety because of kind of who they are in some ways, and their project went very well and they had a relaxed supervisor. There can be so many different factors that affect your experience.
I think Anna summed that up quite well. It is very person dependent, and if you're maybe more prone to being affected by certain things, like maybe you don't deal with confrontation well, that might happen if you argue over equipment, say, then it might affect you. But things do get better, and if you do feel that you're suffering from ill mental health, UCL does have a counselling service and other support services in place, and any other institutions probably have the same thing as well, certainly in the UK.
I think if you know that you have the potential to become anxious or suffer sometimes with depression or anxiety, when you start your PhD, it's not a bad idea to investigate what support is available at your university. And here at UCL, they offer some really good courses on stress management. I've done almost all of them. I can really recommend that if you tool yourself up, if you develop those skills, it will really help you with your PhD.
So in hearing about this, Anna, I'm almost imagining a pathway for a PhD student where they're concentrating on their research, but they're also concentrating on another pathway, which is developing supplementary skills that may be important to them.
Definitely, yes. And fantastically, there is an enormous provision actually at UCL of training that you can do for free, which, as I have experienced, if you're in the outside world, in doing a job in a company, you have to pay for that kind of training. You have to pay quite a lot of money, actually, for the kind of training that we offer for free at UCL. Even things like project management, that costs tons of money, actually. So yeah, it's a wonderful opportunity to develop yourself and your CV.
Okay, so in the next section, we're going to be talking about the process of applying to a PhD. Now, in the conversation we had before we started recording, Stephen, Anna, you mentioned somewhat diverse experiences of applying to your own PhDs. Stephen, why don't you talk us through your process?
Well, mine was quite straightforward in that I was doing my fourth year master's project, and I decided through that research that, I would like to do a PhD because I like the research. So I asked my supervisor, and she said, well, actually, I have this PhD I'm writing the funding proposal for, and it can really help PhD supervisors if they have someone in mind to do it, because it shows the funding body it's a slightly more certain thing. So I said, yes, I'm going to do that then. And that was it, really. So you charm your way into it, talk your way into it, whatever, but you've got to show enthusiasm. And you can help your supervisor and they can help you in that respect.
Why do you think that worked out so relatively easily?
Because my supervisor was aware of my competence in the lab. I think that was definitely helpful. And she said, well, you can clearly do this. I think the chemistry is a bit more challenging, going from P block to transition metals. But you've got these skills from doing the masters. You'll develop them further. So that's great. If they know I've got someone in place, I'm probably more likely to get the funding. It's the case award with this company as well. And so it looks good on their part. And I think that's how it worked out.
And was the supervisor already aware of your desire to pursue research?
Yes.
Okay. Anna, how about your experience?
Well, as I've alluded to already, I didn't go straight from my master's into a PhD, which is probably the normal way of doing it. I was a little bit unusual, although plenty of people do what I did. So because I wasn't working at university, I wasn't doing a degree at the time when I was looking for a PhD, I looked around online. I knew that I wanted to do inorganic chemistry, so I knew the field that I wanted to work in, and I basically looked at researchers' pages to see what research they were doing, and then I contacted people personally, just emailed them and said, hi, I'm interested in the work that you do, I'd like to do a PhD, have you got any openings? Very, very sort of prospective, very like there was no particular jobs I was applying for, I was just asking people.
How did it feel to send those emails?
It was, well, for me, because I was still working at the time, I wasn't sure if I was going to get a PhD position. I was quite worried if anyone would actually take a chance on me. So it didn't exactly feel real. I wasn't really sure if anyone would say yes, so it was still quite safe in a way. So I didn't mind being quite open with people. I was very open about my situation, so when I was offered a position, I went through an interview process with like a proper interview panel, and they really grilled me. So in the end, when they gave me the PhD position, I felt like I'd earned it.
I'm going to take you back a step, please, Anna. So what was the path like between sending that email to getting in that interview?
So I sent the email, and the response I received was, you sound like you have the right skill set, and I do have some projects coming up that I'm looking for funding for, and but there are a couple of other students who are also interested, so let's see how it develops. So it did take a little bit of time because getting funding takes time, and there were other students involved. So we went through this interview process, which was that was interesting. I had to present on my undergraduate master's research, which I was like 2-3 years after doing. So I had to remember a lot.
What would you say to those who are potentially thinking of taking time out between their master's and their PhD?
I think it can be really beneficial, because if you go straight into a PhD and your heart really isn't in it, then, as we've spoken about before, you will lack the motivation to see you through to the end, and you may find it quite difficult. I didn't really know what I wanted to do at the end of my master's degree, so I searched around for a bit, did a couple of different things. I travelled, I worked in publishing, and then I really knew that I wanted to do a PhD. I was certain. So when I went into it, I had the motivation to do the work it required. And I think mature students, which I was, even though I was like 26, mature students can sometimes be slightly more serious about their work. They can be, they're not looking for the student experience it's not a continuous experience from master's to PhD. So maybe they're a bit more focused on what they're doing because they have such a goal in mind.
Okay, so those are two really interesting approaches to getting a PhD. What other processes and approaches are there?
Well, if I could put my careers hat on, there are obviously, just for completeness, there's the direct route that I took and just discussed straight with the staff member that knew me, or there's Anna's route where she took a break and then saw what was out there. Probably the main thing you could do is to look directly at departmental websites. If you don't want to approach the staff member, they often advertise which PhD positions they have, and then you apply for that and go through, as Anna's done so, the interview process, which may or may not involve a presentation of previous research. You can also look on various jobs websites such as jobs.ac.uk, and that's worth signing up to actually. If you can get these sort of weekly emails of jobs in your area that you're interested in. That's how I got my postdoc. Or other things, approach staff directly, or if you're really focused, what you could do is even write your own research proposal, which is uncharted territory for a lot of people, and then approach a supervisor, will you support me in this and supervise me? And what I'm thinking about are some of the international schemes that you can apply to, such as Marie Curie. You've got an idea, you can take it yourself. That is based in Europe, and they pay quite well though.
How would someone go about writing their own research proposal?
First thing I would do is make sure I understood what goes in there, which might mean I need to get some training on it. Often universities will provide some sort of training. At this stage, you're probably still an undergraduate student, which is why you would have to be extremely dedicated or have a really good idea, maybe from your master's, to do it. Research proposals will often involve literature review, so what is the current state of the art and what impact can you make with your project? They'll often ask you to provide milestones, so what do you expect to have done and by when? And of course they want to know that you have a supervisor in an institution that is prepared to supervise you over that for a PhD. A lot of the forms can just be found online of the various websites, and I think it's well worth having a look through them and reading the accompanying notes. If you feel it might be too much for you, then by all means you can go down the other routes as well. As I say, that's for really ambitious people.
Okay, so I get there are loads of different variations. If someone was to ask, and I'm going to use air quotes here, what's the normal way of applying for a PhD? Is there such a thing?
Normal is what you know. I would argue it's just talking to your supervisor. I suppose probably, if I'm thinking more internationally here, it would be as if you were applying for a job. So you would see the advert either on a departmental website or on a separate website, and you would just apply for it. Make sure you have an academic CV ready, and you might be required to write a personal statement or a cover letter explaining why you fit that role, and make sure you tick all the essentials boxes if they have those.
Terrific. And in one sentence, Stephen, what is an academic CV?
I can give you one word: long. An academic CV is different from a standard CV in the sense that you can go over the 2 pages. It basically includes your general CV, but also a list of publications you've had, a list of presentations you've made at conferences. And this is why it can go on and on and on, particularly when you get to more senior levels in academia, when you could probably write a whole book for your CV. But, for example, in my case, by the time I finished my postdoc, it was 7 pages of A4 long.
Anna, there's a furrowed brow there. What are you thinking?
I was amazed. 7 pages, wow. I don't think I ever wrote an academic CV because I was offered my postdoc informally and then didn't. So I applied for funding with my supervisor. I didn't have to actually give a CV in. Oh no, maybe I did actually.
Well, I gave my CV. My postdoc was an informal application.
Yeah.
So up until coming back to the UK after the Netherlands, I admit I've been really lucky with my positions. But it's certainly, whatever you're doing, worth having a CV as a working document. And if you're not sure, both an academic and a standard one. And an academic one will be longer because you probably need to go into a bit more detail about each position you've done and the research and the skills you've done in it.
One last thing I want to hit on before moving on from the process of applying to a PhD, and I'm aware neither of you might have done this, so correct me if I'm wrong, the personal statement or the motivational letter, whatever you want to call it, what do you think works well in that document?
I would say show that you've understood what the a PhD involves in terms of the research topic. So look through the advert, underline some keywords, and in your personal statement / cover letter, make sure that you say, I've done this relates very strongly to this, and I therefore feel I could do this part of the research. Show enthusiasm. You're not likely to be snapped up if you just sound bored. If there is a list of you need to have these skills, make sure that you give an example of how you've used each one and how capable you are. They've given you the answers. You've just got to pick them out and just make it into a nice brief document, often 1 to 2 sides of A4. It varies depending on the position.
Great. How would you describe showing good enthusiasm?
Try to vary your sentences a bit more. Make it less like a list. Use enthusiastic words like exciting, or I felt very motivated by this. I want to do this. It's much better than saying I did this, I did that, I did this.
I agree. I love those words, and I think it's really engaging to see the words passion, excitement. It's totally fine to use those on motivational letters. I love seeing them. All right, so I'd like to move on now to the costs associated with doing a PhD. What are your views on this?
Well, it kind of depends on the area you work in. So in chemistry and most physical sciences, we have fully funded or part funded, but more realistically, fully funded PhD positions, because the materials that we work with, the chemicals, the equipment, they're really expensive. So it would be impossible to self-fund, or very unlikely to self-fund a PhD position. But if you are in the social sciences, it's actually way more common to self-fund or have a part-funded PhD where you support yourself, because you don't have those overheads, you don't have those costs, and there's less funding available in those areas often.
Does supporting yourself look like teaching posts?
Yeah, so even in the chemistry department, we offer opportunities for PhD students to earn more money, and I know they do in other departments. So it can be teaching, demonstrating in the undergraduate labs, doing marking. There can be UCAS days, so open days for the department, which you help out for. We also have some outreach opportunities, which are funded and you can be paid for. So all of that happens for chemists on top of their PhD stipends, which are paid quarterly.
And you mentioned outreach opportunities. Could you elaborate there for me, please?
Yes, well, actually, I coordinate the Spectroscopy in a Suitcase outreach project, which is funded by the Royal Society of Chemistry. And basically, it's a series of workshops that students deliver, so PhD students and undergraduates, to college-level students, so normally 16 or 17-year-olds, and they bring a spectrometer in a suitcase to those schools, and we pay for their travel and everything, and they basically give a nice presentation on IR spectroscopy and mass spectrometry, and they then help the students to use the IR spectrometer that they bring, and it's quite fun, and it doesn't last that long, and then you get paid for the privilege.
Sounds like there's quite a number of ways you can supplement your income as a PhD student.
Absolutely.
Speaking of supplementing your income, I would probably suggest that be careful in what you pick and don't overdo it, because a PhD is essentially a full-time job, and the supplementary stuff that Anna was talking about kind of slots nicely into it. But if you're thinking of doing a weekend job in a bar at the same time, I would strongly advise that you don't, unless you don't require sleep.
Stephen, you mentioned the full-time job aspect. I think that's a really interesting one, because I've heard of some people who treat their PhD as a job, who come in between 9 to 5, albeit that's quite a rare occurrence. What is your experience of potentially your own experience, potentially other researchers around you, of, I guess, time management of PhDs? Can it bleed into other parts of your life? What works?
Again, it's very person dependent. For me, I found it somewhat difficult with a synthetic chemistry PhD to stick to 9 to 5. Sometimes it required coming in earlier, sometimes it required leaving later, hopefully not both on the same day, but I'm not going to say that didn't happen. And I tried to balance it out elsewhere, but for me, it did kind of take over my life, because I found that in the evenings when I was at home, I was reading papers to try to catch up with the literature, because if you're in a fume cupboard all day doing your reactions, you don't necessarily get the time to sit down. But that said, if you were running a long reaction, you could be a little bit more relaxed during the middle of the day. Not to say doing nothing, but just take it a bit easier. Otherwise, it might have gone on top of me a little bit.
Okay. Anna, what was your experience like on that front?
I did not treat it like a 9-to-5 job. I think that part of that was because I had a 9-to-5 job, and I found that somewhat restrictive. I'm more productive in the afternoons and evening times, and my work tended to shift. My pattern of work tended to shift. So I wouldn't be in very early, but I would tend to be leaving a little bit later than some other people. And as Stephen said, sometimes the reaction will last longer than an 8-hour day, and sometimes the reaction will be much shorter than you expected, and you don't have anything else going on that day, and there's a great exhibition down the road. What's wonderful about a PhD is you can be so flexible. You have access to the department almost 24 hours, 365 days a year, almost. And you're the boss of your time as long as you're safe. So obviously there always has to be somebody else in the building, and if you're in the lab, somebody else in the lab. Yeah.
I think ultimately, if the work gets done, it's fine. You can generally dictate your own hours, but it might also depend a little bit on your supervisor. If, for example, I was aware of one occasion where lots of people were just not in when the supervisor was coming up to the lab, then went and said, I expect everyone to be in core hours, which is 10 to 4. You've got to make the most of your time with your supervisor as well. Again, it completely depends on your situation.
Okay, so I'm just going to mention one last thing on this topic, and that's the Grants Register. It's a gigantic blue book. It sits in the UCL library as well as the UCL Careers department, and it is an utterly comprehensive list of postgraduate funding options, from small charities to bursaries all the way up to the giant research grants. So if you're unsure of different ways of funding your study, or you want access to other supplemental means, it's a great thing to check out. So before we sign out, are there any other things that either of you would like to mention when weighing up whether or not to do a PhD?
I would say it's great if you have a career in mind when you start. You may not end up going into that career. I didn't. I wanted to go into industry, and actually I've become a teacher. I'm a teaching fellow at UCL. But I think you should be mindful of your future as you're going through your PhD, and to not see a PhD as 3 or 4 years where you don't have to think about your career. That's actually, you're setting yourself up for a bit of a tough time when you finish. So definitely bear careers in mind.
Stephen?
It's an opportunity to build up your CV, and it's not just about doing the research, it's also about building your network and getting known more widely throughout that particular research community, because you've got to be thinking about your career, and that will help you as well. So things like LinkedIn can really help. Get on there and maybe be a little bit shameless. If you're looking for a job, you can put that on there, but you've got to get people to know you first. So while you're doing a PhD, you can use that. I'm aware of a lot of PhD students on Twitter who are tweeting every step of their PhD, but that gets them noticed as well. So that's also something to think about.
All right, so thank you both for joining me for this podcast on should I do a PhD or not. So last things, what if students want to know more about this topic, should I do a PhD? What would you recommend?
Well, we do have rather wonderful one-to-one chemistry appointments with Raj. So if you're not sure about something, or you just want advice on something, I can really recommend just booking an appointment and having a chat. We've had some amazing feedback from the students about those who've been to them. So I can highly recommend that.
So if you're currently a student at UCL, you have a wealth of academics all around you. So it's a great idea to go and speak to your personal tutor, maybe make an appointment with someone else in the area of research that you might want to go into. And you can even speak to PhD students who are currently doing it. So find out what it's like day to day.
How approachable would you say they are?
Yeah, pretty approachable. Generally, pretty approachable.
So I'm going to sign out by reiterating Stephen's earlier point that you have access to one-to-one chemistry careers appointments. They're available through a link on Moodle. I personally would love to see you for a careers appointment if you're thinking about doing a PhD, or you're weighing up options, or even if you're directly in between a yes and a no on a PhD. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not going to give you any suggestions. It's going to be a case of asking you open questions that will hopefully lead you to your own realization of whether it's the right step for you or not. Hopefully this podcast has been useful. We've loved recording it for you. All the best.